The gun was pressed to Nathaniel Castellano's temple when Margaret Hale stepped between him and death, hands raised, voice steady. "Kill him," she said, "and you'll never find out what your own brother did to your father." The room went silent. Nobody expected the fat girl to be the one holding all the cards. Nobody watched Margaret Hale. That was the first thing she'd learned about surviving inside the Hale family. Invisibility was a kind of armor. At galas thrown in her father's honor, men in tailored Brioni suits walked past her without a glance, their eyes sliding over her soft arms and rounded face to find her older brother Thomas, or her father Richard Hale, patriarch of Chicago's second-largest crime syndicate. Margaret had grown used to it. She'd built a life in the space between people's attention, learning to listen while no one thought to guard their tongues around her. She was 26 years old, and she had read every ledger her father kept since she was 14. The night everything changed, she wasn't supposed to be at the warehouse at all. Thomas had told her to stay home, the way he always did before a business meeting. Code for something bloodier than the word implied. But Margaret had a bad feeling crawling up her spine since breakfast, since she'd seen her father's hands shake pouring his coffee. Richard Hale's hands never shook, so she'd followed the black Escalade in her own car, parked 2 blocks off of Halsted Street, and walked the rest of the way in the dark, her heels abandoned in the footwell for flats she kept for exactly this reason. She heard the voices before she saw the guns. The Castellano family didn't do warehouses lightly. When Nathaniel Castellano walked into a room, the room rearranged itself around him, 6 bodyguards fanning out like a held breath, his charcoal suit sitting on his frame like it had been born there instead of tailored. He was the kind of handsome that made men nervous, rather than women swoon, sharp-jawed and cold-eyed, a scar through his left eyebrow that the tabloids liked to speculate about and never confirm. He was 34 and had run the Castellano empire for 6 years, since his father's body was found in the trunk of a burned Mercedes on Lower Wacker Drive. Margaret had never spoken to him. She'd seen him twice, both times from across ballrooms, both times feeling something she refused to name. Tight, she watched from behind a stack of shipping crates as her father offered Nathaniel a deal that made her stomach drop. A merger of territories that Thomas had never mentioned, brokered in secret, built on a lie Margaret could already see unraveling in the way her father's eyes wouldn't quite meet Nathaniel's. "You're asking me to hand over the docks," Nathaniel said, voice flat as a closed door, "based on a debt you claim my father owed yours. A debt with no paper trail, no witnesses, just your word." "My word has been good for 30 years, Richard said. "Your word," Nathaniel said, stepping closer, "got my father killed." The air went taut. Margaret saw her father's hand twitch toward his coat, saw Nathaniel's head of security, a broad-shouldered man named Victor, shift his weight onto the balls of his feet. She understood, with the particular clarity of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading rooms other people ignored her in, that in the next 10 seconds, someone was going to die. She stepped out from behind the crates. "He's lying," Margaret said, and her voice didn't shake, though her hands, hidden in her coat pockets, had curled into fists. "My father is lying to you, Mr. Castellano. There is no debt. There's a ledger, I've seen it, that shows your family overpaid the Hale organization for port access for 4 years running. If anyone owes anyone, it's my father who owes yours." Every gun in the room turned toward her. Thomas found her first, grabbing her arm hard enough to bruise. "Margaret, what the hell?" "Let her finish," Nathaniel said quietly, and something in his voice made even Thomas go still. Margaret looked at her father, and for the first time in her life, she watched him look afraid of her. "You've been skimming from the Castellano accounts since Nathaniel's father died," she said. "You blamed the shortfall on rising insurance costs. I ran the numbers 3 years ago because I was bored, because nobody thinks to hide anything from the fat girl in the corner. You owe him, Dad, not the other way around." The silence afterward had weight to it, like something about to fall. Nathaniel studied her the way a man studies a hand of cards he hadn't expected to see. Not with contempt. Not with pity, the two reactions she'd braced herself for her whole life. With something closer to genuine surprise, and beneath that, a flicker of respect he seemed almost annoyed to be feeling. "Who are you?" he asked. "Margaret Hale," she said, the daughter nobody bothered to introduce. Richard Hale's voice cracked through the warehouse like a whip. "Get her out of here." But Nathaniel raised one hand, and every man in his employ froze. "No, she stays. I want to hear the rest of what she knows." He looked at Richard with the particular calm of a man who no longer needed to raise his voice to be terrifying. "Consider tonight's meeting postponed, Richard. I'll be in touch." Miss Hale, his eyes returned to Margaret, and something in them made her chest go tight. "Will be coming with me." It wasn't a request. The Castellano penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a building on North Michigan Avenue, glass walls looking out over a city that had no idea how much blood it had paid for the view. Margaret sat on a leather couch that probably cost more than her car, hands folded in her lap, while Nathaniel poured 2 glasses of scotch and didn't offer her one, as if testing whether she'd ask. She didn't. "You could have gotten yourself killed tonight," he said finally, setting one glass down untouched. "I did the math before I walked out from behind those crates," Margaret said. "The odds of my father shooting first were low. The odds of you shooting me lower. You don't get a reputation for being ruthless by killing unarmed women who just saved your life." Something that wasn't quite a smile moved across his mouth. "You think you saved my life? I think in about 4 more seconds, either you or my father would have made a decision neither of you could take back. I bought you both a door instead of a wall." She met his eyes, steady despite the tremor she could feel starting somewhere beneath her ribs. "You're welcome, by the way." He laughed, short, surprised, like it had escaped before he could stop it. Margaret filed that away. Nathaniel Castellano did not seem like a man who laughed often. "Why would you betray your own father to a rival?" he asked, the humor gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the cold calculation she'd heard about in whispers at every gala she'd ever haunted the edges of. "What do you get out of this?" Margaret thought about lying. She thought about giving him some clever half-truth designed to make herself look strategic instead of simply, plainly honest. But she was tired of being underestimated, tired of watching her father's organization rot from lies he told to protect his own comfort. "I get to stop pretending my father is a good man," she said. "I get to stop watching him bleed people dry and call it business. That debt is real, Mr. Castellano. I've watched him falsify records for 6 years. I used to think loyalty meant silence. I don't think that anymore." Nathaniel walked to the window, his back to her, city lights catching the sharp line of his shoulders. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something quieter, something that sounded almost like exhaustion wearing a very expensive suit. "My father used to say loyalty is the only currency that doesn't devalue," he said. "Then he was murdered by a man he trusted, and I inherited an empire built on peoples who smile at my face and calculate my death behind it." He turned. "You walked into a room full of guns to tell the truth. I haven't met anyone who's done that in years. Maybe you've been standing in the wrong rooms." His eyes narrowed, not with anger, with something closer to interest, sharp and unwelcome, like a door he didn't remember leaving unlocked. "You're not what I expected, Miss Hale." "Chubby girls rarely are," she said, flat, daring him to flinch. He didn't. "I wasn't talking about your size," he said, and something in the quiet certainty of it made her breath catch. "I was talking about your spine." Before she could answer, the penthouse door burst open, and Victor stumbled in with blood on his collar, gun drawn, breathing hard. "Boss, it's your brother. Anthony's been shot outside the Waldorf. They're saying it was Hale men." Margaret shot to her feet. "That's impossible. My father wouldn't authorize a hit tonight, not after what just happened." "Not your father," Victor said grimly, looking at her now with open suspicion. "Witnesses say it was Thomas Hale." The floor seemed to tilt beneath her. "Thomas. Her brother, who'd grabbed her arm in the warehouse, who'd looked at her like she'd betrayed the family simply by telling the truth. Thomas, who she suddenly understood, might have been planning something of his own long before tonight's meeting ever started. Nathaniel's expression had gone somewhere cold and unreachable, the warmth of moments ago sealed shut like a door slamming. He crossed the room in 3 strides and gripped Margaret's arm, not cruelly, but with a finality that made her stomach drop. "You're not leaving this building," he said. "Not until I understand exactly what your family is playing at. And if your brother killed mine tonight, Miss Hale," his voice dropped low, almost gentle, which somehow made it more frightening than a shout, "I promise you, there is no version of the truth that saves you from what happens next." Behind him, sirens rose faint and distant through the glass, climbing toward the penthouse like a warning nobody would get to heed in time. Anthony Castellano survived the shooting, but only barely. A bullet lodged an inch from his spine. 3 hours of surgery at a private hospital on Rush Street, where Nathaniel paid the entire surgical staff in cash to guarantee their silence. Margaret spent those 3 hours in a hospital hallway under armed guard, not under arrest, not quite free, watching Nathaniel pace a hole into the tile floor. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. She was afraid for him, which felt far more dangerous. "You don't have to, Stacy," he said once, not looking at her. "I know," Margaret said. "I'm staying anyway." When Anthony was finally stable, Nathaniel disappeared into a stairwell and didn't come back for 20 minutes. Margaret found him there, jacket off, tie loosened, sitting on the concrete steps like a man who'd run out of places to be strong. She sat down beside him without asking permission. "Everyone I love gets shot," he said quietly. "My father, now my brother. Eventually it'll be me, and someone will throw a party." "I doubt that," Margaret said. "You don't know the people I run this empire with. I know you didn't ask them to sit with you on hospital stairs at 2 in the morning, she said. "You asked me." He looked at her then, really looked, the way she imagined he looked at ledgers and battle plans, searching for the weakness, the angle, the lie. He didn't find one. Something in his face cracked open, just slightly, just enough that she saw the boy he must have been before the empire swallowed him whole. "I don't know what to do with you, Margaret Hale," he admitted. "You could start by trusting me," she said. "I think I can find out who really shot your brother. And I don't think it was my brother at all." That night, back in the penthouse, Margaret pulled up the Hale family's shipping manifests on her phone, records Thomas didn't know she still had access to, and cross-referenced them against police reports Victor managed to pull. The timeline didn't fit. Thomas had been at a restaurant on Rush Street with 3 witnesses at the exact moment Anthony was shot 4 miles away. Someone had wanted it to look like Thomas. "There's only one person who benefits from a war between our families," Margaret said slowly, the pieces sliding into place with sickening clarity. "Someone who profits either way this ends, whether the Hales fall or the Castellanos do." "Who?" Margaret's stomach turned to ice. "Your head of security." "Victor." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't dismiss it. "Victor has been with my family since before I was born. He served my father." "Then ask him why the Waldorf's private security footage from tonight. Footage your organization definitely has access to. Hasn't been pulled yet," Margaret said. "Ask him why he was the one who identified the shooter as a Hale man before any actual witness statement existed." The silence that followed was its own kind of confession. They found the footage 40 minutes later, after Nathaniel personally threatened to gut the building's security firm. It showed a man in a gray jacket, face angled carefully away from every camera except one, a blind spot Victor himself had approved during a renovation 8 months prior. The shooter's build, his gait, the way he favored his left leg, exactly like a man who'd broken it in a car accident 3 years back. Margaret recognized it instantly, because she'd sat across from that limp at 1,000 family dinners. It wasn't Victor who pulled the trigger. It was her own father. "Richard didn't want a merger," Margaret said, the words tasting like betrayal on her tongue. He wanted a war he could survive, and you couldn't. If Anthony died and Thomas took the blame, the Castellano organization would tear itself apart, hunting my brother, while my father consolidated territory during the chaos. He was never trying to save the family business. He was trying to save himself, and he was willing to sacrifice Thomas to do it. And Victor? Nathaniel asked, voice dangerously quiet. Paid to look the other way, or paid to help build the frame? Margaret met his eyes, steady even as her whole understanding of her own family crumbled beneath her. I need you to believe me when I say I didn't know. Not until tonight. Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had none of the coldness she'd braced herself for. I believe you, he said, which terrifies me more than if I didn't. The balance of power in the room, in the entire fragile architecture between two crime families, had just shifted completely. Richard Hale, who had spent 30 years positioning himself as the reasonable elder statesman of Chicago's underworld, was exposed as the architect of a war built on a lie. And the daughter he'd never bothered to see clearly was the only person standing between both families and total collapse. Richard Hale didn't run. That was, in its own terrible way, the most honest thing he'd done all night. He arrived at the Castellano penthouse at dawn, alone, unarmed, Thomas beside him looking like a man who'd aged a decade in a single evening. Margaret stood beside Nathaniel when they walked in, and she watched her father's eyes catch on that positioning. His daughter standing with the enemy, no longer invisible, no longer ignorable. You've made your accusation, Richard said, voice steady in the way of a man used to controlling every room he entered. Where's your proof? The footage, Nathaniel said. The limp. The timeline that puts your son with 3 witnesses at the exact moment you needed him framed. Should I continue, Richard? Or would you like to skip to the part where you explain it to your daughter? Richard's composure didn't crack. It simply quietly gave way the way old foundations do, not with a crash, but with a slow and undeniable settling. Everything I have done, he said, I have done to protect this family. You shot Nathaniel's brother to protect a lie, Margaret said, and her voice, for the first time that night, shook. You were going to let Thomas take the fall for it. Your own son. Was that protection too? Thomas would have survived it, Richard said, and something in the flat certainty of his voice told Margaret he genuinely believed that made it acceptable. The Castellanos would have gone to war with each other, hunting a man they couldn't find, and I would have picked up the pieces of both families. That's not cruelty, Margaret. That's strategy. Thomas, silent until now, finally spoke, his voice raw. You were going to sacrifice me. I was going to save you, Richard snapped. There's a difference you're too young to understand. Margaret watched her brother's face break, watched 30 years of blind loyalty to their father collapse in real time, and something in her ached for him, even as her own fury burned steady and cold. This was the moment, she understood, that would define whatever came after. Not the gun, not the war, but whether the people in this room chose to keep protecting lies or finally tell the truth. That was when Victor made his mistake. He'd been standing near the penthouse doors, forgotten in the emotional wreckage of the room, and Margaret was the only one who saw him reach slowly into his jacket, not for a weapon aimed at Richard, but at Nathaniel, whose back was half-turned in the heat of the confrontation. Victor had been paid twice over, she realized in a single sickening breath. Once to help frame Thomas, and once, apparently, to make sure that whatever truth came out tonight, Nathaniel Castellano didn't live to act on it. There was no time to shout a warning that would reach him in time, no time to physically cross the room. Margaret did the only thing she had ever been good at. She used what people always underestimated about her. Victor, she said, loud and clear and utterly unafraid, tell them about the second payment, the one from the Hartwell account, wired the same week you approved the camera blind spot at the Waldorf. I found it 3 hours ago. I already sent it to the Tribune's financial desk with a timed release if I don't check in by 6 a.m. It was a lie. She hadn't sent anything anywhere. But it was a lie built from a truth she actually did have. The Hartwell account was real, she had found it, and the desperate flicker in Victor's eyes told her she'd guessed correctly about exactly what it would do to him. Victor froze, gun half drawn, calculating. In a room full of men trained to solve problems with violence, Margaret had just made violence the one thing that could no longer solve his problem. "You're bluffing," Victor said. "Maybe," Margaret said. "Are you willing to bet your life on that math? Because I did the math on my father's lie in about 10 seconds tonight, and I was right about that too." Nathaniel turned then, saw the gun, saw the terror and calculation warring on Victor's face, and in the half-second before anyone else understood what was happening, he moved, not toward Victor, but toward Margaret, putting his own body between her and a bullet that hadn't been fired yet, the instinct arriving faster than thought. It was Victor's own hesitation that saved them both. Two of Nathaniel's men, reading the room a beat behind Margaret but faster than everyone else, closed the distance and disarmed him before he could decide whether her bluff was real. In the wreckage of the following silence, Richard Hale sank into a chair like the weight of 30 years had finally caught up to him all at once, and Margaret realized she was shaking, not from fear, but from the particular exhaustion of having just held an entire room together with nothing but her own voice. Nathaniel hadn't moved from where he'd placed himself in front of her. When he finally looked down, his hand found hers, and he didn't let go. "You just talked a man out of pulling a trigger," he said quietly, "using a lie you invented in real time." "I didn't invent all of it," Margaret said. "Just enough." In the weeks that followed, the truth reshaped everything. Richard Hale's own organization, once loyal to him out of fear more than devotion, turned on him the moment the story became impossible to bury. A man who'd shot a rival's brother and framed his own son to hide it. Thomas, freed from a lie he'd never asked to carry, chose exile over vengeance, taking a quiet position rebuilding legitimate businesses in Milwaukee, finally free of a family that had never once protected him the way it claimed to. And Margaret, the daughter no one had watched, the woman everyone had underestimated, became the one person both families trusted enough to broker the peace that followed, not because of her name, and not because of anything she looked like, but because she had never once, in the worst night of her life, stopped telling the truth. Nathaniel found her on the balcony of the penthouse. One evening, months later, the city lights spread out below them like something finally worth trusting. "I used to think strength looked like control," he said, coming to stand beside her, like never flinching, never showing anyone what it cost you. "And now I think it looks like a woman who walked into a room full of guns and told the truth anyway," he said. "Twice." Margaret smiled, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't brace herself for the moment someone would look past her to find something else worth seeing. He was already looking right at her. In the end, it was never the guns, the empires, or the blood that decided who survived. It was the truth Margaret refused to bury and the loyalty she chose over silence. Two broken families found peace because one woman was brave enough to be seen. If this story moved you, like the video, share it with someone who loves mafia romance, and subscribe so you never miss the next unforgettable story.